Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are continuing in our playlist, taking a look at the campaign that we've created here at Zern Central for you all, the Liberation of Kairos. As a quick reminder, this is a Terran-themed campaign, so it's played with the Terrans as the primary protagonist from their perspective, facing off against a Zerg swarm. And so we already walked through in the last video, we kind of give the general overview of how all this works. There's going to be 6 total missions. You're going to be playing a total of 5 of them. And today we're going to be looking at the first one. Okay. And so as we lead off, as we look at mission 1, this is the arrival, right? We come onto it. And so as we do with all of our mission structures, we start off with just a really quick high concept behind everything, right? The Terran forces, they're going to land on the planet, and they're going to try to hold critical locations in the area to prevent them from creating a beachhead. Nice and simple. You're going to have a little read aloud section. You can obviously skip past this with your group, but from a theme and from a theme and flavor perspective, if you want to kind of get into the zone and into the mindset of who these characters are, a number of these, not the adjutant, but all of the others are playable characters as potential hero options for your force. And so being able to kind of get a vibe for what these characters are like, the way that they're thinking about it, and in some cases, helping to subtly explain to you why the campaign is built the way it is, you're going to find that in the read aloud section. So as they're talking things through, you're learning that, okay, like they're getting ready to come in. They're sending out a ghost team who are going to be infiltrating separately from the rest of everybody else to kind of scout out where the primary Zerg hive cluster is. So whereas this is a safe place to begin the landing, it's obviously not Zerg Central, right? In terms of where the primary enemies are located. We get to meet obviously Captain Jane Ryland, who's kind of a liaison with the Ghost protocol in the local area. You've got, of course, your local adjutant who's responsible for helping you with coordination. You've got Major Lana Hale, who chimes in. She's kind of basically second in command of Argos Company underneath of yourself as the commander. And then you have Sergeant Ty Fletcher, just one of the Marines who's, he's been involved in First Platoon for a long time, giving his thoughts on what they can do. You have Corporal Cora Dalton with the Medical Corps, who is chiming in on her thoughts on things. And then you've got guys like Sergeant Shane Alston, who's a firebat, who kind of is asking for specifics on information to get ideas for recon and intelligence on the ground. And you learn that the security liaison who was supposed to be briefing on with local intelligence has not checked in, which comes up later. But just suffice it to say, they tell you, hey, okay, we think we found a good place for us to land. We're going to land, right? And that's your basic blow by blow of the mission loadout. If you want me and a group of roleplay gamer / actors and actresses that I happen to know in the area, local to me, to do a read through of these read aloud so you can kind of hear it StarCraft style, let us know down in the comments below. I'll chat with them and we'll see what they say. It's at least a possibility. But at the very minimum, what the read aloud is supposed to do is kind of walk you through what's going on, what's happening before you start playing each individual game. It sets it up as part of the story. And then from there, we're going to do the setup section. Setup is going to be you setting up the board. There's always going to be predetermined deployment and predetermined mission objectives going into these, okay? Because this is not standard gameplay. This is not matched play, where I think it's a really good thing that you have kind of a veto system, right? For people to be able to pick out, so which missions are we actually doing? Which victory objectives are we going to be playing with, and what is our deployment going to look like? Okay, but in the case of narrative play, I find that to be a lot less useful, and I tend to find that it means that there's a little more time just setting everything up and not getting into it, which I'd prefer to make a little bit faster for people to be able to do. So we pre-build it, but the first one, since it's also kind of designed to get you into how StarCraft is played as a tabletop game, it's all stock standard stuff. So we're using the char planes setup for deployment and objective structures. And so you'll notice that the objectives are all marked in yellow. That's where their locations are going to be. And then your deployment zones are marked in the green and the yellow at the top left and the top right, respectively. Once again, as we mentioned in our previous video, you'll also find the map ID over there. So if you do want to grab the map from on the portal from Archon Studios for StarCraft, you certainly can. We also give the name of it in case you want to search for it by name. In this case, the fight is happening just outside the town of Telesil on the planet of Kairos, and so that's hence why the map is called Telesil. The result, however, and this is, I think, really important, is that it means that if you are playing on Tabletop Simulator with people who are not near you, you can load this map, right? It is perfectly available to you. You'd have to then select the char planes format, and for some of the other ones going forward, it may be a little bit more tricky in terms of loading up the objectives and where things need to go, just by virtue of the fact that, again, not all that stuff is easily preloaded into the system. I'm working on designing out deployment setups and mission objective setups for all of these as well, so you can load those also. But those are all in process. We'll see how some of those go, especially since some of these mission objectives are going to be very different from standard competitive play. And then in addition to the primary objectives, with the 3 objectives that you're trying to hold, there are also going to be 8 non-primary objectives, 8 secondary objectives. And these are scrap material tokens located all across the planet. And so you see them all there in blue across the board. And each of these you guys will be placing individually. So we give example placements here, but they're not strictly where you need to place them, right? You can place them in other places. You just have to follow the rules that you see over there on the left-hand side. They can't be within 6 inches of one another. They have to be beyond 3 inches of a board edge, and they have to be in one of each of the 8 kind of 12 by 12 squares that are around the edges. There should be none of them in the center square, right? If you kind of look at it with the white lines, that's what the white lines are kind of helping to break up. Hopefully that's visual and easily accessible to all of you as to how that should work, but that's kind of how it goes. And so the result is that these 8 scrap material tokens, they're not going to contribute to who wins the match. They're going to contribute to upgrading your units after the match is completed. Okay, so you want to capture as many of those as possible. And these are, you move on to them, you pick them up, you remove them, as will be explained a little bit later. So these ones will not be sticking around. So it is very much a first come, first serve sort of thing. So keep that in mind. And then after that's done, you're going to be rolling 2d6 to select your deployment zone. But obviously, so it could be left or right. This one, it doesn't really matter as to which one it is. We just chose left for Argos Company, right for Razos Brute. But again, it doesn't strictly matter as to which one is which. And then after that, you're going to get the forces. You're going to get your minimums and maximums. So in this case, you have 800 minerals and 80 Vespene gas in order to spend. You obviously cannot go above that. You can technically spend as little as you want. Doesn't really matter. And then it tells you that you're going to have a starting supply of 3. And we also do give you the maximum. Over the course of the entire match, you're only going to have a maximum supply of 7. So maybe don't run more than 7 supply. That is extremely hard to do at 800 minerals in this game. But I guess hypothetically it's possible. And obviously we don't know all the units that will ever be allowed, right? We don't know the cost of infested Terran, right? We aren't even getting infested Terran this year. We're getting infested Marines probably later on this year. But infested Terran are dudes who don't even have guns, right? So they may be even cheaper than that. They're certainly not as tanky and as beefy as Marines. So, they may be even cheaper. We don't even know what that cost is going to be yet. So toward that end, we do let you know what the maximum is just so you can make smart decisions. And we do also place some restrictions on the first one, right? So we tell you, hey, limit of Marines, medics, fire bats, and heroes. Obviously, with you and your friends, you can do whatever you want. We intentionally designed this because we didn't want some crazy shenanigan-y sort of things to come out. And so we didn't want people to run like, 3 Goliaths, 4 Goliaths, right? Or something like that, which, there's some downsides to that build, but there are also a lot of upsides to that build. Most notably, when you're doing objective control, the fact they got to do like 10 wounds to you in order to remove any supply off of that objective is really, really nice, right? And so in order to kind of lean it in, we kind of leaned into, let's do some of the lighter stuff, right? And so admittedly for the Zerg, it's actually basically everything. It's not queens, but it's everything that comes in the starter set and the first wave of stuff. So in that sense, it is a little more restrictive on some than it is for others, to be fair. But from the practice games that we did involving these, it seemed to be just fine in terms of having the abilities. And so we give you an idea of kind of how it works out. You'll also notice that in each one of these, we end up running 1 hero at least that is provided for you in Appendix 1 of this campaign that are tied to it. So in this case, Sergeant Ty Fletcher from 1st Platoon, one of the lead Marines is there who will be helping to lead all the other Marines and doing the difficult work of clearing the ground. And then he's going to be met by one of the local hive queens, Ahirga, who serves Razoth. And so, and then the small clutch of Zerg that are underneath of her. And so you've got, again, quick rock through. We also give you, of course, your faction cards. So we also have cutouts of these in Appendix 3 as well, which hopefully will be useful for you, and new profiles for new stuff, including things like the Fire Bat. Now, the Fire Bat's worth noting as to why we did it this way. First of all, in terms of cost, I mean, it's cheaper than a Marauder because they are weaker than Marauders, right? They can get a really reasonable armor save because of that Juggernaut plating. That being said, again, by that point, they're pretty close to the cost of 2 Marauders. It works 2 to 4. They also use the same base size of Marauders, if I'm not mistaken. So because of that, you might find that you can basically just use the models one for one if you want to. You don't have to go out and 3D print, although there are 3D printable fire bats out there. And we are going to be getting fire bats near the end of the year. So in an ideal world, you won't have to proxy for very long, right? You'll have access to them. We also included the incinerator gauntlets, one of the upgrades that you can get for them, which in this case just increases their chance to hit, because I figured if you were trying to increase their, I don't know, damage or anything else like that, you could actually go pretty crazy if they're using things like flame templates, which it seems like we might be using in this game. We'll have to see if, and obviously all of this is subject to change. If we discover that there's a flame unit that comes out and it uses a different mechanic, we'll just quickly update this in order to reflect stuff. And we'll probably at some point even just remove this entirely once the new fire bat profile exists, because then you guys will just use the standard one. But we also went in the movement phase with kind of a unique option for these guys, which is really digging into the StarCraft 1 lore behind these guys, where the reason why they're called fire bats instead of something like, say, a fire drake is because they had jetpacks. And so they could fly, right? And it used the same fuel system as their flamethrowers. Is how it ended up working. Which is also why they're so bulky, especially in the back. That's what's going on there. And so we went ahead and we just included a jetpack, right? So this is an upgrade. You pay 20 points, and when performing a move action, you can just move through all units and over terrain of any height with no penalty, right? Because you fly over them is what ends up happening. I think this makes a very short range sort of unit. You're talking like maybe 5-6 inches or so worth of range, far more effective as a choice, because at least you can get to things you want to get to, and you aren't being slowed down by the presence of walls and things like that, where people can kind of cheekily make it so that they can escape you and you have trouble getting to them. I think that will be very useful. And then you notice that in the assault phase, they only have the one attack, obviously, with the flame gauntlet. And the one big benefit that these guys have for not being like massively wound heavy and not being massively durable, all things considered, and still having that short range, is that they're doing the same attack in close combat as they are in assault. So if people do choose to charge these guys with Zerglings or Zealots, those are kind of like the ideal targets you'd be fighting. You're actually going to do pretty well against them, because you can attack whatever unit charges you with your Flame Gauntlet. And then you can attack them again with the exact same attack, which is a pretty reasonable and pretty powerful attack. And so, again, they're going to fill in a very specific role. This is designed for clearing melee-centric chaff. It's basically what these are, because then they'll close the distance with you, so you don't need to worry quite as much about being able to get within distance of them. Maybe you slow them down for like one turn with like, I don't know, you've got a bunch of medics nearby, and you kind of cause the enemy to be a little hesitant of moving in too close. And so you buy a little bit of extra time before they come in to maybe be able to pop an attack off. You might even be able to get 3 attacks on the same unit if you're moving late enough. But I think that makes the fire bat an interesting choice and a relatively cheap one, right? I mean, that's the thing. If you find that you don't have a whole lot of points left, you can always be like, well, I'm just going to drop 100 points on a fire bat. That's cheaper than everything else so far, right? And that's going to give me 2 fire bats, which is not a lot of fire bats, but it is more than, if I were to try to yank other points out of other parts of the build in order to try to shove in another Marine unit, right? There comes a point where having another medic unit actually is not helpful, because as good as medics are, and as much as I think you should always run at least 1 unit of them, as long as you're running biological Terran, I generally tend to think there comes a point where there's actually too many and you're not doing enough damage to the enemy to keep all of those medics safe. And so because of that, I think the Firebat will fill an interesting role. If it doesn't, please let us know. And then you've got your primary objectives. We're just using the frontline scenario. So we list the exact same things, but it's the exact same things as is on the skirmish card, right, that you see over in the over on the card from Archon Studios. You then have your secondary objectives, and the way this works is that you're going to find a bunch of those scrap material tokens strewn across the battlefield, and you gain 1 campaign point for each that you recover, and a unit that ends its activation in the movement phase or assault phase in base contact with the scrap material token recovers it, removing it from the board. So if you need to perform move actions in either the movement phase or the assault phase, you can pick those up, which is really nice. It also means, and note this, you have to end your activation in base contact with the scrap material token. So you can't like grab it on the go while still continuing to move. So as part of a rolling retreat, just know that if you still want to grab that scrap material token, you are going to have to end your retreat a little bit early, possibly. Just a thing to think about, Okay. It also means that literally a unit, so at least one model in the unit, does have to end in base contact with it. So it's not being within an inch, it's not being within 3 inches. You do have to be in base contact with this thing in order to grab it. But as soon as you do end up recovering at the end of that unit's activation, it's not at the end of the turn, it's not at the end of the phase. At the end of that unit's activation, it is removed from the board and scored for whichever team. Okay. And so there's a maximum of 8 campaign points that are available. Because of where your starting positions are, both teams actually have a reasonable chance of getting to a number of them relatively quick. Obviously, tactical cards may help. Decisions to move instead of shooting may help. There's a lot of things that may help. But remember that the campaign points are not going to help you win the match. These are campaign points. These are not victory points. Okay. And so toward that end, during the game, at the end of each of the rounds, of course, additional supply depots and overlords appear. So we end up with an increase of our supply by 1 in each of these. And at the end of round 5, you're going to compare your victory points as laid out in the primary objectives up above. And the player with the highest score is the winner. And they add 2 campaign points to their army roster, and the loser adds 1. Okay, so everybody's always getting something off of these. The minimum you would get in this campaign for campaign points, assuming that you don't do a single secondary objective and you lose every single match, you're still going to get at least 4. Okay, because obviously the last mission isn't going to give you any because it's the last mission. We're done with the campaign at that point. The maximum you can get is actually quite high, but I highly doubt it's going to be that lopsided, right? Especially since, again, going back up here to the setup side of things, you're going to have at least 2 tokens that are being deployed somewhere near the deployment zones of your own side. And so literally your first movement phase, the first turn, depending on how far you can move, might actually put you, depending on where you choose to place those, might actually put you in base contact with a token. So your first activation, you're claiming 1. Your opponent's first activation, they claim 1. Your next activation, you claim 1, and their next activation, they claim 1. You're probably going to get at least 2, right? I mean, your opponent would have to go pretty aggressive and pretty greedy, especially on their tactical card side of things, in order to try to, try to grab something at another point, right? Furthermore, it can't be claimed at the end of a round. So even if somebody has a warp in pylon or something else like that, I guess pylon wouldn't matter because that's Protoss based, right? But if somebody has like a drop ship ability where at the end of the turn they get to drop a unit, even if they were to drop a unit on the very far side of the board in base contact, they aren't able to pick it up because it's at the end of their activation in the movement and assault phase. Okay, so end of round hijinks of deploying people to specific spots does not work. Okay. 6 pools will work well. Proxy barracks will work well, right? Like there's lots of different things you can do to try to get to some more of these if you want to. But the primary reason for trying to do that is because these campaign points are going to upgrade your units, right? They're going to make them more tanky. They're going to make them more effective in close combat. They're going to make them more effective at range combat. They're going to give them useful special rules, sometimes additional movement, right? There's a bunch of different things. Give them the ability to detect hidden units that are within a certain range of them, right? Like there's a lot of different things that you can get as upgrades for your stuff. And all of that comes from how many campaign points you can spend in order to buy those. And you can see Appendix 2 for more details on that. But that's where we are as of Mission 1 and where it goes. We're now going to move into Mission 2 and what Mission 2 has to offer you. So in this case, Mission 2, the Defense of Hope's Rest, is where you're doing the mission that you were told to do, right? Where you're going to be escorting all of the invalids and the medical crew out of the Thales Foundation facility at Hope's Rest to their escape crafts to escape the planet while holding off the Zerg. They've been holding them off for a while now. Their defenses are getting weak, so they've called for help, and that's where you guys come in. And so Dr. Hypatia Thompson ends up talking with everybody and giving you some thoughts. Yes, she is very similarly coded to Dr. Ariel Hansen, just with a few less surprises and sudden twists and reveals. Okay, she's a little more open and honest with you guys. And so, I think that's good. I know some people like to give Dr. Hansen a really bad rap. I've worked with a lot of scared people in my life. I work with a lot of people who are trauma victims. And so I kind of just get it. Okay. Like sometimes people don't share everything with you. Sometimes you get the raw end of the deal. That's the way it goes. So I don't personally have a problem, but I know some people do, whatever. So just know if this is giving you the evacuation vibes from Wings of Liberty, it is supposed to give you the evacuation vibes from Wings of Liberty. But what it will also do in an ideal world is it will also maybe give a bit of healing because here's a similar-ish sort of mission, but without you having to walk an insanely far distance to get to the starport. You're already kind of starting at the starport, and they're just putting people on trauma beds and getting them over into the shuttles as you guys are getting in there. They have a limited amount of time where people can be off of things like life support and other stuff like that. So they didn't want to load everybody up on the ship well in advance and lose a whole bunch of patients. And so because of that, they are going to do it, but they've done their best, right? They've maintained two of the bunkers in the surround, and so that's kind of nice. They've gotten everybody into the hospital ward, which is the closest building to the escape vessels. So like they've tried to make it as short of a walk as they possibly can. Like they're doing their best to actually be helpful people for you to protect. Okay, which is kind of nice because we've all played games of various kinds where you have to do an escort mission and the NPC that's rolling with you has a death wish, apparently, right? They're not very wise in terms of what they do. But your crew's just kind of talking over with them. We explain why your battle cruiser isn't able to just rain down holy fire against everybody that's down on the planet, because they're needed to protect the green zone. So that way you guys have an actual operational base to provide you with support. And so they cannot make it all the way out here to Hope's Rest, which is 2 clicks away. In addition to that, as they're kind of talking through stuff, you start discussing a bit of strategy, right? So in this case, the bunkers are going to be helping to defend your people, but Corporal Cora Dalton reminds you it might be a useful thing in case the bunkers go down quickly to have medical staff on hand to protect your soldiers as well, because you might need those. In addition, people like Lieutenant Natalie Cromwell, who's basically a Marine, but a sniper-based Marine. So if you have multiple copies, for example, of Jim Raynor, you might consider taking his extra set of sniper arms, or just if you have one copy of Jim and you don't want to build him with a sniper rifle, you can always build him with the C-14, which is great. And a really good upgrade on that. More on that when we talk about Jim in a little bit on our blog. But in this case, if you want to have more of like an Overwatch character, it might be a useful thing to have a character who kind of sits in the back but has really good range so that she can kind of plunk away at solid targets and do good removal for you, even if she's only removing, say, one model, but a high wound model a turn, right? And so, we kind of are talking over with you potential strategy on how to go through it all just by reading through the read aloud. Look at that. It's flavorful, it's fluff, but it is actually a little bit useful, okay? And then as Argos surges forth, you get the location. So you'll see here, Argos Company will be starting on the southern board edge. Razos Brood will be starting on the northern board edge. This one is locked, right? It's not like the last one where you can kind of roll to see which deployment zone you want. Doesn't really matter. But in this case, yeah, you're down there. And then, of course, your 3 objectives are there in yellow. They're spaced at the 19, 18, and 27-inch mark across the 36 by 36 board. We, of course, give you the map ID in case you want to load it, which is kind of fun. And the way it's going to work is going to be very simple. You're going to have your forces. In this case, the Terrans are technically getting less points to start with. It's only 730 minerals, whereas Razos Brood is getting 900. But the reason why is because you're basically starting with 170 points of Marines already pre-built. And that's the Thales Foundation security forces that are already there. So you're going to start with at least 1 unit already in place. And then if you want to buy them upgrades, you can. Because I know some people, they want to have like an Ag 12 on everything in case there are roaches present, or, future armored units in the future that may end up coming out. Some people may be totally cool with just having a little small tactical squad of Marines, and they don't really want to invest in them. Some people may want combat shields on everybody, right? Whatever your goal is, whatever your jam is, you can upgrade these. You're just always guaranteed you have to have at least 1 squad of Marines. And that's the guys that you're coming in to help and reinforce that still remain here, okay? Note in passing that, your starting supply this time around is 4, so you can fit in a little more. You can add some things with a little more punch. In our example list, we've got a, 1 supply Marauder hero alongside the squad of Marines and more Marauders, and then you've got a big squad of Marines that'll be coming in. This specific example is not heeding Corporal Dalton's advice. You are sending your medics to help remove the trauma patients. You are not fielding them on the battlefield because we decided, hey, if we got bunkers, we're going to go for punch. With Razos Brood, they went kind of a different route where you've got Gawk, who is a very veteran roach leader, alongside a unit of roaches, small squad of Zerglings, and a small squad of Banelings. More on that a little bit later. And then you've got some Hydralisks in reserve ready to come on as needed. Then we get our new profile, and this is the Baneling. Baneling is structured very similarly to the Zergling, except that, one, it uses a small template doing certain types of damage. So within a certain number of inches, it does damage whatever, being the parentheses and brackets, respectively. And then it also has the ability, potentially, if you choose to take the upgrade, to give it regenerative acid, where after resolving the volatile burst action, friendly units within 2 inches can perform a heal action. So if you have them close to your own units, you can end up actually recovering wounds on things like, for example, roaches and hydralisks and stuff like that. It also means that if somebody lost models this phase, not this round, it can be used to restore those models. And this is mostly designed to reflect the fact that if you have them running alongside Zerglings, Zerglings only have 1 wound, the heal 2 wouldn't mean anything, right? And so it does allow you in this specific niche case, as long as it's the same assault phase or combat phase where you're using volatile burst, you can actually recover some of your former Zerglings. They went down, but then the healing bile got on them and they ended up getting back up. Okay. Kind of a cool unit. Again, basically you're throwing away your own models and thus reducing your own supply in order to do damage, but still kind of interesting. And then finally, we talk a little bit about the transports. And so the transports at the bottom are objective tokens. We recommend using like 50mm tokens that are a little bit bigger and easier to tell. But obviously you can use whatever you want. It doesn't really matter. The big thing here is that these are objectives that you're not going to be trying to hold in the traditional sense. You're going to be attacking them. So in this case, they have an armor value of 4+, and they have 8 wounds, and we do give a list of keywords. So in case you surge against armored targets, or in case you get a bonus against mechanical targets, or if you can only attack ground units, you know exactly what their profile tag keywords are. Okay. And then it simply specifies that if a transport reduces 0 wounds, it is removed from play along with anyone who's aboard the transport. Okay. As you'll soon see later. And then you've got your bunkers. Your bunkers are armor 3+ with 8 wounds, and they also have following keywords, so on and so forth. And then once it's destroyed, you just remove the bunker, and any units that were inside take the bunker spot on the table. Okay. There are STL files, by the way, out there for bunkers if you want to find some. Some of them are pretty cool looking. I do rather like them myself. Some of them are even on Thingiverse, which is kind of awesome. And then you've got your primary objectives. It's very simple. The Terran player gains 1 victory point for each refugee token that boards or escapes in a transport. And then the Zerg player gains 3 victory points for each destroyed transport, and both players gain VPs equal to the supply that they destroy on that round. Okay? And then for your secondary objectives, it's very simple. Both sides are really just trying to destroy as many enemy units as possible. Now, note that unit and supply are not necessarily interchangeable. In some cases, they are, right? So, for example, a medic unit, once you well, actually, medics are a bad example of that because you can get a medic unit down to 0 supply without actually removing the unit. Goliaths, right, are a good example of this kind of thing, right, where they don't start losing supply until they're actually gone. And so, yes, removing supply and removing the unit are, in fact, the same thing. But if you were to, say, get a medic unit down to 1 model left, that medic unit is still there. So you wouldn't score secondary objectives for bringing them down to 0 supply. You will only score an extra campaign point if you bring them down to 0 models. And what this does is it creates an interesting choice for both sides when it comes to playing out this scenario, because it means, yeah, you can throw both, you guys can both throw all of your troops against the line and keep them there until the very, very bitter end in order to try to either break through or hold off the swarm that's coming towards you. But you're also coughing up campaign points potentially if you do that. Whereas if you pull away with a squad of Marines that's down to like, 2 to 3 guys or something like that, if you choose to pull away to disengage and continue running in order to get away from the enemy might decide not to continue following up to try to destroy you. They might decide to just try to win the scenario, right? At which point they're going to go after the transports, and now that squad's going to be, sure, more preserved. You kept some campaign points away from your opponent, but maybe they won the scenario, and thus they did win more campaign points than you trying to do that, right? And so it all depends, right, as to what your strategy is. There's a lot of different questions here as to what's happening, but I think in general, I think it makes for a very interesting choice in an all-or-nothing defensive scenario, right? Because do you choose to run away with a unit that's been worked down pretty heavily and is in danger of, giving your opponent extra bonuses to boost their army? Do you try to hide those units, or do you just try to go for winning the scenario at all costs, right? And I think having interesting choices is really good. And then when it comes to the end of the game stuff, you'll notice that at the end of the turns, a couple of things happen. First of all, obviously, you're all going to be increasing your supply by 1. That happens every time. But also, you're going to have an alternation of placing a refugee token on an objective, which can literally be anything. Could even be a coin if you want to. It doesn't really matter. The point is that you're going to place a refugee token on a transport. That way, your opponent knows, if they're the Zerg, who they're going, which transports are the highest priority ones to remove, right? And then at the end of every even-numbered round, one of these surviving loaded transports is going to take off. So that objective is going to suddenly disappear. Even if it's damaged, it still gets away, at which point it scores for the, what's it called? It scores for the Terran player, for Argos Company. And so you could end up in a really interesting choice where there's potentially a transport that doesn't leave on a given turn, right? Because maybe the only loaded transport that was around got destroyed, right? And so because of that, it doesn't actually have a chance to flee unless you don't have a chance to score for the refugee token that got away. And so because of this, it is interesting. It means that there's a total of potentially 6 victory points to win, plus amount of supply that they've removed for the Terrans, because they get 1 point every time they successfully load a refugee token. They get 1 victory point every time that one of them successfully escapes on the transport. So potentially up to 6 plus supply that they've removed. Whereas the Zerg, if they can remove 3 transports, they can score up to 9 victory points plus the amount of supply that they remove. Okay, at which point they would have an easier chance technically of winning, but they also have to cross more of the board. So I feel like it works out pretty well. In our test games with this, it actually came out to be pretty even. It was a pretty nail biter. I think Argos Company pulled it out technically every time, but it was a nail biter every time, which I think is really excellent. It really just came down to sometimes some rolls were really bad. And in some cases, the Zerg players just made decisions of, I'm down to 4 Zerglings. I don't want to lose all these Zerglings and give you a campaign point too if there's a potential that I might still lose the match. So I'm going to try to preserve this Zergling unit instead of actually pressing to try to destroy the transport. And that's fair because when you look at victory, winning gives you 2 campaign points, losing gives you 1. So I'm not saying don't play the scenario and just go for removing models so you can get campaign points by removing units. Because again, I don't know how many units there are actually going to be, but there is a legitimate question at a point of how much are you actually losing by not winning the scenario, right? You're really just handing 1 campaign point to your opponent. If they remove 2 campaign points worth of units from you by removing 2 entire units, then they've actually done better even if they lose the match than if they had won, right? So because that's kind of an interesting thing to think about as you're playing it out. But again, this is one of the kind of side arc sort of stuff that I think is kind of awesome about how to play this. It is not going to feel necessarily like a standard competitive match. And then finally, to close out mission 2, we have an after-action cutscene, because after-action cutscenes are pretty cool. Your adjutant tells you that you're being hailed by a Protoss vessel. The transmission is really weak, but it is coming from the planet's surface, and so they're on hold for you on the communicator. And then their scans also detect a functioning factory on the planet's surface near Thales Station. And so if you want to grab it, we can dispatch a team to reclaim it presently. Okay? But then we're going to require resources. You cannot do both. And so we get our choice missions, which will be our next video in this series to kind of walk you through how these scenarios work. But what do you think? Do you like this setup? Do you like this style? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.